A black man, a suit, a Bluetooth in his ear. He stood in silence, waiting for a meeting he was born to lead. But in America, being still, while black can be seen as dangerous, within minutes a call was made. 2 officers arrived. One reached for his weapon, the other stayed quiet. And the man in the suit, he said 6 calm words. "I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." But they didn't listen. They made him kneel. They questioned his existence. And when their superior walked in, she didn't just recognize the man on the floor, she reported to him. Because the agent they tried to arrest, he was the one reviewing their transfer requests. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments. It was a Wednesday morning, one of those overcast days where the light filters through the clouds in long, flat streaks, washing the world in gray, making everything feel quieter than it should be. The city hadn't quite woken up yet, just a slow churn of traffic, scattered footsteps on polished stone floors, and the low hum of elevators rising and falling behind tinted walls. Inside the central lobby of the Hamilton Park building, the kind of place where deals were signed and passwords whispered, everything looked composed. Neutral-tone furniture, symmetrical ferns in ceramic pots, and a receptionist desk that stretched too far for one person to truly manage. No music played, no one raised their voice. Everything was measured, smooth, predictable. And yet, Elias Monroe stood out, but not for the reasons someone might expect. He didn't fidget, he didn't pace nervously or mutter under his breath. He simply stood by the far glass wall, one hand resting on the strap of a well-worn leather briefcase, the other swiping calmly through his phone. Dressed in a charcoal gray blazer and a light blue dress shirt with tailored slacks and clean black shoes, he looked like a man used to being in control of his time. A man who knew how to wait without letting waiting define him. His Bluetooth earpiece blinked softly, a small blue light pulsing every few seconds, as he listened to a recorded case file for the 3rd time that morning. Every so often he would murmur a note or a confirmation under his breath, concise, quiet, nothing out of place. Still, perception can twist in silence. A white receptionist at the front desk, young, alert, and barely 2 weeks into the job, kept glancing in Elias's direction, her brows slightly knit. Maybe it was the earpiece, maybe the stillness, maybe the way he didn't ask for help. She shifted in her seat, looked down at her monitor, then back up. When her coworker walked off to the copy room, she hesitated, then reached for the phone. "Hi, this is Chelsea at Hamilton Park Reception," she whispered. "I think we've got someone acting off." Kind of pacing, talking to himself. Just looks suspicious. She didn't know his name. Didn't ask. She didn't describe a weapon or a threat, just left a blank space for someone else to fill in with fear. Meanwhile, Elias stayed right where he was, unaware that someone across the lobby had just made a decision that would alter the rhythm of his day. He checked the time, 10:12. His meeting with Grayson Intel's executive team was set for 10:30. He'd arrived early on purpose, as he always did, not just out of habit but out of a quiet instinct carved by years in the field. Always arrive early, always observe the room. The air conditioning kicked on, making the polished floor tiles shimmer faintly under the vent. He adjusted his stance, rolled one shoulder slightly, then tapped the side of his earpiece. Subject confirmed. Location quiet. Awaiting contact. Standing by, he said, almost like a whisper, the cadence precise, professional. He didn't notice Chelsea watching him from behind the monitor, chewing her lip. She wasn't afraid, not really. She was uncertain. And uncertainty, when paired with inexperience and a subconscious catalog of stereotypes, can become a dangerous thing. She folded her arms tightly as if to assure herself she'd done the right thing, though her eyes never stopped flicking in his direction. Elias, still focused on his screen, didn't notice the security camera above him, quietly shifting to follow his movement. Outside, less than 2 blocks away, a patrol cruiser eased to the curb. The call that came through had been vague. Possible, suspicious male, possibly casing the building, no weapon seen, but that kind of phrasing carries its own weight. Officer Scott Halden sat behind the wheel, jaw tight, fingers already drumming on the steering wheel. His partner, Officer Lena Cruz, read the details off the dispatch tablet one more time. Black male, late 40s or 50s, business attire, Bluetooth earpiece standing near the wall. She glanced up. Not much to go on. Halden shrugged. Still gotta check it out. People don't call for no reason. Cruz didn't reply, just clipped her body camera into place. Inside, Elias finally moved, not out of restlessness but because he saw a reflection in the glass. A patrol car slowing near the main doors. 2 uniforms stepping out. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear but in calculation. He didn't expect them. He hadn't done anything to warrant them. But he also knew better than to assume their presence didn't include him. He stood straighter, let his hands remain visible, kept his voice still. In his mind, the years of FBI training rearranged themselves like a stack of cards. Visible posture, calm tone, no sudden moves. Not because he was guilty, but because he was aware. The officers entered. The marble floor gave a faint echo under their boots. Chelsea straightened her heart, quickening not with excitement but with a sort of validation. Someone listened to me. Elias watched as they approached, their eyes narrowing before a word had even been said. He didn't reach for his ID. He waited. He gave them the space to make the first move. Because that's what it meant sometimes to survive an interaction, not just participate in it. "Sir, can we have a word with you?" Halden's voice was firm, practiced. Elias nodded once. "Of course. What's this about?" The tone in his voice was neutral, not defensive, but layered with something else. A readiness to step into a role he hadn't volunteered for. A role he'd played before. The seconds stretched. The lobby, so quiet a moment ago, now felt too loud. Elias noticed the receptionist looking down again, her hands clenched under the desk. He wondered, not for the first time, what people really saw when they looked at him. A professional, a threat, a question mark they didn't want to clarify. Somewhere behind all of that, he felt a familiar ache rise in his chest. Not panic, not anger, just exhaustion. The quiet kind. The kind you learn to carry so well it becomes part of your posture. And in that moment, Elias understood what kind of day this would be. Not the one he prepared for, but the one that asked more of him than any case ever had. It started with a phone call that wasn't meant to sound urgent, but had just enough of the wrong words, in just the right order, to set something dangerous in motion. Chelsea, still seated behind the wide reception desk, cradled the receiver between her shoulder and ear, as if whispering into it might shield her from responsibility. Her voice was low, hesitant, but not unsure enough to stop. "Yeah, I'm not saying he's doing anything, but he's been standing there a while, talking to himself, maybe pacing. Something feels off." She didn't know Elias's name, didn't ask what he was there for, didn't think to walk over and say, "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you?" Because she had already made a decision, one that felt small at the time, even thoughtful. Better safe than sorry, she told herself, though she couldn't quite name what she thought the danger might be. Outside, the clouds thickened, and the light in the parking lot dimmed to a silvery hue that made everything look colder than it was. The dispatcher at Precinct Station 6 logged the call without much emotion. It came through as a low-level priority. Possible suspicious person in lobby, no weapon seen, caller unsure. That kind of phrasing sits in a strange place, vague enough to stay low, on the urgency list, pointed enough to trigger someone's attention. Officer Scott Halden was in the middle of logging paperwork in his cruiser engine idling near the curb when the call pinged his screen. He looked at it once, then again, lips tightening as he reached for the radio and responded. Unit 114 responding. 2 minutes out. His partner, Officer Lena Cruz, glanced over, raising an eyebrow as she strapped on her vest. Another vague lobby complaint, she asked, the tone in her voice trying to make light of it, but Halden wasn't smiling. They pulled away from the curb and began the short drive to Hamilton Park. Halden's silence filled the space between them, more heavily than the drone of traffic outside. Cruz, though quieter by nature, had learned to read that silence as a warning, not anger, but a deep kind of conviction that didn't shift easily once it settled. She tapped the screen again, rereading the call log. Black male, mid-50s, business attire, Bluetooth earpiece standing near the front wall. Her voice was steady, observational, and she let the facts hang there for a beat before adding, "Could be nothing." Halden finally spoke, eyes still fixed ahead. "Could be something too." Back inside the lobby, Elias hadn't moved much. He'd shifted his stance, leaned into the corner slightly to get better reception, and checked a message on his secure FBI channel. His contact at Grayson Intel was running late, not unusual in a corporate setting like this. But now his trained instincts were picking up on something subtle, a shift in the air, a small twitch of energy that often preceded unwanted attention. He saw a shadow move near the reception desk just for a moment, and Chelsea's head dipped low, like someone finishing a conversation they weren't supposed to start. He didn't need to hear what she'd said to know it wasn't about confirming his appointment. Elias took a quiet breath and focused on controlling the things he could, his posture, his tone, his expression. He reminded himself that the truth was on his side, that he belonged here, that his ID was real, and his presence legitimate. And yet he also knew that truth doesn't always win the first 5 minutes of a confrontation. Sometimes it has to wait in line, behind fear, behind assumption, behind uniforms, trained to react before they listen. When the officers stepped into the lobby, the temperature of the room didn't change, but something in its rhythm did. Their footsteps echoed too loudly on the tile floor. Chelsea looked up, her eyes wide, but unsure whether to look proud or nervous. Halden scanned the space immediately, his gaze locking onto Elias with something more than curiosity. It was suspicion preloaded, already formed before a word had been spoken. Cruz was behind him, quieter, more measured, her hand, not yet near her holster, but not too far either. Elias turned to face them fully, not startled but prepared. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice calm, but his spine locked, straight muscles alert in a way that didn't show unless you were trained to see it. Halden didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer and said, "We received a call about a possible suspicious individual in the area." Elias nodded slowly, blinking once. "I'm FBI. Special Agent Elias Monroe. I'm here for a meeting." He reached slowly toward his briefcase. "I can show you my credentials." Halden's voice rose, not a shout, but sharp enough to cut through the space between them. "Sir, I need you to stop moving and keep your hands visible." Elias froze right there in the lobby, one hand hovering just above the zipper. He didn't sigh, didn't frown, just lowered his arm and said quietly, "Understood." He didn't ask why. He didn't argue, not because he was afraid, but because he had seen how fast situations like this could flip sideways. And because the difference between calm and confrontation often came down to seconds, to inches, to someone else's unspoken story projected onto your skin. Cruz looked over at the desk, then back to Elias, her eyes flicking briefly to the briefcase. "Where's the ID located?" she asked, her voice softer, not quite breaking ranks, but trying to slow the descent. Elias answered evenly. "Side pocket zipped. Badge case inside. Glock 19 concealed right hip, fully authorized." Halden's shoulders stayed tight. Cruz didn't move yet. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded, stretched thin with implication. Chelsea bit her lip again and turned away from the scene she had created, but wasn't ready to claim. And Elias, standing there with a calm exterior and 1,000 calculations running just beneath the surface, knew this wasn't just about today. This was about how little it took to put everything he was on trial before he'd even said his name. Elias had been in situations where everything turned volatile in a blink, where silence could carry the weight of a weapon, and yet nothing about this quiet lobby seemed designed for threat until now. The marble floors, once neutral, now echoed every step like a warning. The air, once cool, suddenly pressed close against his skin as though tension itself had a temperature. He had barely shifted his weight when Officer Halden stiffened again, the kind of posture not born of fear, but of expectation of a scenario he thought he understood before it even began. Elias kept his eyes level, watching Halden's stance, the way his right hand hovered just inches from the holster, not drawn, but ready in a way that made the room feel narrower by the second. He wasn't unfamiliar with this, rhythm, words edged in command, a posture of presumed authority, and a gaze that refused to register nuance. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the wall," Halden said, his tone clipped, carrying just enough control to mask the tension behind it. Elias nodded slowly, his voice even. "No problem. I'm already here, standing in plain sight." "What exactly do you need from me?" The words were calm but not submissive, measured like someone who had walked this line before and knew exactly where it could split. He stepped slightly to the side, keeping his movements deliberate, slow enough to broadcast safety, but never so slow that it could be misconstrued as resistance. In another part of the room, Cruz shifted quietly, watching both men, now her gaze flicking from Elias's hands to Halden's tightening jaw. She wasn't interrupting, not yet, but there was a question already forming behind her eyes, one she didn't speak aloud, not because she didn't see what was happening, but because she hadn't yet decided what to do with it. Elias glanced once at the receptionist who sat frozen behind the desk, her hands clutched under her chin, eyes wide, like someone who had summoned a storm and now wished she could call it back. Then he turned his focus inward, recalibrating his posture, flattening the edge of frustration that threatened to rise. He told himself the same thing he'd told younger agents in training when they walked into unfriendly spaces: control what you can, document what you can't, and never give someone a reason to rewrite your story before you get to speak it. I need to see some identification. Halden barked a little louder this time, as if volume could replace logic. Elias nodded again. "It's in my bag," he replied, moving slowly, the way someone does when they're aware they're being watched by a loaded assumption. "Let me reach for it." "Don't reach!" Halden snapped his hand, flinching near his sidearm, and that single command, sharp and instinctive, seemed to freeze the entire room in place. Elias froze mid-motion, his hand inches above the zipper of his briefcase, then slowly raised both palms to shoulder height. He didn't blink. He didn't argue. He just stood there in the stillness, the kind that hums beneath your ribs when you realize the air has stopped moving. "I'm not reaching for anything," he said, his voice lower now, slower but still intact. "I said I have credentials. FBI identification. Would you prefer to retrieve it yourself?" Cruz finally stepped closer, something unreadable moving across her face. "Where is it located?" she asked, her voice, less rigid, quieter but firmer, in a way that carried control without threat. "Side pocket," Elias answered. "Silver case. Photo ID badge, bureau credentials. All standard." He remained motionless as she approached, crouched beside the bag, and carefully unzipped the pocket. Inside, just as he said, was the badge case, worn leather, creased at the edges, and heavy with the weight of years spent earning the authority that now meant so little to the man still watching him like a suspect. Cruz stood and opened it, her eyes scanning the details quickly. Badge identification, clear, photo clearance level, everything in perfect order. She didn't say anything at first. Just looked at Elias, then back at Halden, and gave a small nod. "It checks out." But Halden didn't lower his guard. He didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed hard and flat, like he couldn't quite reconcile what he was hearing with what he had already decided to believe. Elias remained still, his knees starting to stiffen slightly from the locked posture, his breath slow and quiet, every muscle trained to wait, not react. He'd been here before, not in this exact lobby, not in this exact town, but in this same atmosphere where your entire legitimacy gets questioned, not because of something you did, but because of something someone else thought you might do. This wasn't a standoff, not yet, but it was something more dangerous, a moment no one in the room wanted to claim, because claiming it would mean admitting how fragile the whole structure really was. Finally, Halden spoke, his voice tight. "I still need you to sit on the ground, sir." Hands visible. There was no logic in the command, only the residue of fear and ego trying to maintain control over a scene that had already spun past reason. Elias looked at him for a long moment, not blinking, not breaking, and then without a word lowered himself slowly onto the cold tile floor. He didn't look defeated. He looked like a man who had learned long ago that dignity isn't about standing, it's about choosing how to yield. He placed his hands flat on the floor beside him, his bag untouched, and let the silence settle again, heavier than it had ever been. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Every second he sat there was its own indictment, not of him, but of the system that had brought him to this moment. And though the clock on the wall said only 3 minutes had passed since the officers arrived, for Elias time had stretched into something else entirely, something measured not in seconds, but in choices made too late. The tile beneath Elias's hands was cold, not just from the building's air conditioning, but from something deeper, something that reminded him how quickly comfort could vanish when misjudged by the wrong eyes. He sat upright, back straight, but shoulders relaxed, his breathing slow and controlled, like a man measuring the weight of each second as it passed. Above him, Officer Halden remained standing with his feet wide apart and arms stiff, one hand still hovering too close to the butt of his sidearm, as if retreating now would be a concession he couldn't afford. The badge case sat in Officer Cruz's hands, open, confirmed, and entirely authentic, yet the silence from her partner lingered, as if legitimacy alone wasn't convincing enough to undo what suspicion had already set in motion. Elias didn't look up, but he felt the calculation happening in the air around him, the kind that makes a man second-guess, not just what others see, but whether truth alone will ever be enough to shift it. Cruz had already seen the ID, already checked the badge number, and verified the credentials against the database in her system. She stood a step back now, her brows drawn, her fingers tightening slightly around the leather case, as though trying to reconcile the clarity in her hands with the tension still pulsing in her partner's posture. Her voice, when it finally came, was low but certain. "Everything checks out, Scott. This is Special Agent Elias Monroe, FBI. Assigned to Cybercrime's Washington field office." Halden didn't respond, not at first. His eyes flicked briefly toward Cruz, then dropped again to Elias, as if what he'd just heard couldn't quite reach the part of his brain that had already made its own decisions. It wasn't just disbelief, it was discomfort, the kind that came from realizing the story he'd been playing out in his head had no room for the truth that now stood, or rather sat before him. "Still needs verification," Halden muttered almost to himself, his voice stripped of confidence, now driven by something else, uncertainty, trying to masquerade as protocol. Elias didn't flinch. His palms remained open on the ground, his eyes calm and steady, trained on the space between Halden's boots. "You can call the field office. Ask for Director Calloway or Deputy Rhodes," he said, his voice even but edged with something sharp. "Or you can keep pretending this is about safety and not about control." Cruz didn't move, but her jaw shifted slightly, a reflex she couldn't quite suppress, as if the truth in Elias's words had struck something personal. From behind the reception desk, Chelsea watched it all unfold through a widening haze of regret, her face, pale fingers twitching nervously at the edge of her keyboard. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. She hadn't imagined an armed standoff, or a man on the floor. She'd only wanted someone else to interpret her discomfort, to take the responsibility out of her hands. But now, seeing the scene she had set in motion, she felt the weight of every second stretching out like a quiet indictment against her silence. Outside the building's glass doors, the rhythm of the day continued. Cars hissed along wet pavement. Delivery trucks paused at red lights. People walked briskly by, unaware that just a few feet away, a federal agent was sitting cross-legged on the tile floor, being treated like a threat for doing nothing more than showing up. And inside, time had thickened, slowed the way it does when every eye in the room pretends not to know exactly what's wrong. "I'm not armed beyond my issued sidearm," Elias said, clearly breaking the silence again. "Glock 19, right hip holstered, safety on. You can disarm me if you feel threatened, but let's not pretend there's a reason to be." His words weren't confrontational. They were precise, clinical, even the way you speak when you've learned to narrate your own safety into existence before someone else decides to do it for you. Cruz finally exhaled, and her shoulders lowered half an inch. She stepped forward and knelt beside the bag again, as if doing something, anything would break the spell hanging over them. She picked up the ID again, more carefully this time, and held it up to Halden. "This is real," she said softly, almost gently, like she was reminding him of something he already knew but didn't want to admit. Halden didn't reach for it. He didn't lean in. He just stared at the badge like it was a puzzle missing a piece only he could see. Elias, still seated, tilted his head slightly and said, "You ever ask yourself why it takes a badge to be believed, why standing still can feel like a challenge?" His tone wasn't bitter, but there was something old in it, an exhaustion passed from generation to generation, polished into poise. Halden opened his mouth, then closed it again. His weight shifted from one foot to the other, an unconscious motion of someone whose authority had just cracked slightly under pressure. Cruz looked back at Elias, and in her eyes now was something Elias recognized. Recognition, yes, but also shame. Not loud, not dramatic, just that quiet ache that comes from knowing you stood too long on the wrong side of the moment. She handed the badge back to him slowly, then glanced at Halden and said, "We should call it in, confirm it officially." But I believe him. It was a small statement, barely more than a breath, but in a room like this, small truths carry weight. Elias didn't thank her. He didn't need to. His expression didn't change, but somewhere in the way he blinked, in the way he inhaled just a little deeper, there was acknowledgement not of being saved, but of being seen. And for now, that would be enough. The marble floor beneath him was still cold, and the reception desk was still silent, and Officer Halden still hadn't taken a step back. But something had shifted, not loud, not visible, but present nonetheless. The truth had entered the room, and though it hadn't yet won, it had made itself impossible to ignore. The elevator let out a soft mechanical chime, a sound so ordinary that no one turned at first, but for Elias still seated on the cold lobby floor, it struck like a shift in atmosphere, the air suddenly denser, carrying with it the weight of something long overdue. The doors slid open slowly, and out stepped a woman whose presence didn't demand attention so much as claim it without question, the way some people enter a room and rearrange the balance simply by standing still. She wore a navy blue pantsuit, sharp lines, and quiet authority in every detail, and carried a slim leather portfolio under one arm, while her other hand clutched a stainless steel coffee tumbler, still steaming faintly in the cool air of the lobby. Her name was Cynthia Ellis, Assistant Deputy Director of Cyber Operations at the Bureau's D.C. field office. And before she said a single word, the way her eyes landed on Elias sitting upright, hands visible, surrounded by two uniformed officers, told the entire room that something had just broken loose from the script. She didn't blink, didn't pause, just stepped forward with that deliberate control. Only years in federal law enforcement could refine her voice, cutting clean through the tension. What the hell is going on here? The question wasn't shouted yet. It carried more force than any order barked in uniform, because it wasn't a question at all. It was a judgment already rendered. Halden turned toward her, clearly thrown off by the abrupt entrance, his grip on authority unraveling in real time. "Ma'am, we received a report," someone acting suspiciously in the lobby. He started the words coming out just a beat too fast, as though he was still rehearsing a version of the story that no longer made sense. Cynthia cut him off without hesitation. "This man," she said, motioning toward Elias without taking her eyes off Halden, "is Special Agent Elias Monroe. He's here under my directive on a bureau operation scheduled days ago. So I'm going to ask you again, why is he on the floor?" There was a pause, short but brutal, as Halden looked toward Cruz, then back to Cynthia, struggling for footing in a scene that had just shifted under his boots. Cruz stepped forward, her voice quieter but steadier. "We responded to a call from building reception." He matched the description. There was mention of a concealed weapon. He confirmed he was armed, so we followed protocol. Cynthia's eyes narrowed. "Did he resist?" "No," Cruz replied. "Did he threaten anyone number? Did he fail to identify himself?" Cruz shook her head slowly. "He offered his credentials before we asked." Cynthia turned her gaze back to Halden, and this time there was no trace of confusion in her tone, only the crisp finality of someone pulling the rug out from under a hollow defense. "So what you're telling me is a black man in a suit, standing with a Bluetooth in his ear, was enough to make you put him on the ground?" Halden didn't answer, and in that moment of silence, the real story rose to the surface clear, undeniable. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. He let the stillness speak for him, because sometimes silence is not surrender, but strength, choosing not to explain itself to someone who isn't listening. Cynthia turned to Cruz and held out a business card. "If either of you need to verify his credentials again, my direct line is right there. He's been with the Bureau 12 years. I've personally supervised him for the last 6. He's led more operations than most agents see in a career, and until 5 minutes ago you were about to sit down with him for an intelligence briefing that could affect federal policy." Cruz took the card without a word. Halden didn't move. His fingers twitched slightly, but his feet stayed frozen, as if stepping backward now would admit something he wasn't ready to name. And then from behind the reception desk came a voice no one had asked for, but everyone heard. Chelsea, her voice barely above a whisper, said, I just wasn't sure, I thought." Her words trailed off into air too heavy to finish them. Elias finally looked up at her, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, weariness. "You know what the strange part is?" he asked, voice level. "I was standing right next to the building directory. All you had to do was ask me my name." She blinked at him, lips parted, but no reply came out. She wasn't afraid of him, she was afraid of what she'd allowed herself to believe. And Cynthia, who had said enough already, now delivered the final twist like a blade turned slowly in the quiet. "Before I stepped into this building," she said, her tone quieter but colder. "Now Elias reviewed a personnel file. An officer applied for transfer to our behavioral unit. That file landed on my desk this morning." She turned and looked Halden straight in the eye. "That officer was you." The silence that followed cracked like glass. Cruz looked at Halden. Halden looked at the floor, and Elias, still seated, closed his eyes for a moment, not from relief but because it hurt to be proven right like this. "You were 10 minutes away from making your first impression with the Bureau," Cynthia added, her voice soft but sharp. "And this is what you gave us." No one responded. Nothing moved except the steam still rising from Cynthia's untouched coffee. And in that strange stillness it became clear that this story had already passed the point of redemption. It was now about what each person would do with the mirror being held up in front of them. Elias finally stood slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, not defiant, just grounded like someone whose existence no longer required permission. And as he brushed dust from his sleeve and turned toward Cynthia, there was no need to say anything more. Everything that mattered had already been said. Cynthia didn't move. She stood just a few feet from Officer Halden, her presence quiet but immovable like the final weight that tips a scale that had been straining too long in silence. The fluorescent lights above cast sharp outlines across her features, and yet nothing about her expression was harsh. It was the calm of someone who has seen this kind of moment before and knows precisely what it is. Halden swallowed barely, and for a long second he didn't say a word. Not because he was choosing silence, but because silence was the only thing left to him now that his authority had turned inward and begun to question itself. Elias didn't speak either. He stood a few feet back now, arms relaxed at his sides, face unreadable like a man who had carried these kinds of moments before and knew that the loudest part always came after. It wasn't the confrontation. It was the part when people had to live with what they'd just seen themselves become. Cynthia let the quiet hang for a moment longer, then took a slow step forward and said, "You filled out that application with care, I remember. You listed your commendations, your field history, even the time you de-escalated a domestic disturbance without backup. That caught my attention." Halden blinked eyes, flicking briefly toward Elias, then dropping again. The badge on his chest looked heavier, now the way symbols do when you realize they don't always mean what you hoped they did. Cynthia didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Every word she spoke landed with the clarity of someone who had earned the right to speak without needing to perform. "You were scheduled for a preliminary interview next week. I had Elias review your personnel file this morning as part of our vetting process. He highlighted your instincts, said you might be someone who sees people clearly under pressure." That sentence landed harder than anything else so far. Halden's shoulders tightened. Not from pride, but from the slow burn of shame that rises when you realize someone believed in you more than you believed in yourself. And now Cynthia continued, her gaze unwavering. "We're standing in the aftermath of a choice that wasn't about training or procedure. It was about expectation, and the kind you never wrote down in your file." Chelsea, still seated behind the front desk, seemed to shrink into herself a little more with each passing word. She hadn't spoken again, hadn't tried to explain what she meant or why she had called, but now her fingers trembled slightly against the edge of the desk, and her gaze stayed fixed on a spot on the floor that no longer held Elias's shadow. Cruz stood beside her partner, her body still, but her eyes constantly moving, tracing every subtle shift in the room, trying to read the long, slow collapse of a belief system she hadn't realized was built on sand. Elias finally stepped forward, not to interrupt, but to stand closer, his voice steady but low. "When I flagged your file," he said, "I didn't do it because it was perfect. I did it because it was honest. Because the way you wrote about your mistakes made me think, maybe you knew what they meant." That kind of clarity is rare. Halden didn't lift his head, but his jaw tightened slightly, and in that quiet reaction was the beginning of something, recognition maybe, or the barest shape of accountability forming behind the weight of uniform and pride. Cynthia nodded once slowly. "Everyone gets tested eventually. Not on a form, not in a classroom. Out here. And it's never when you're ready. It's when it's inconvenient, when the script doesn't match the reality. That's when we find out who's really paying attention." She turned slightly not toward Halden but toward Cruz, and sometimes it's not the one giving the order who fails. Sometimes it's the one who stands by, hoping the moment will pass without demanding anything from them. Cruz didn't answer immediately, but the tension in her body changed. Not defensive, just awake now, as if the story she'd told herself about neutrality had begun to unravel in her hands. She glanced once at Halden, then at Elias, and her voice, when it came, was quiet. "I saw the badge. I knew it was real, but I didn't stop it. I didn't say anything." Elias looked at her not with pity or approval, just clarity. "Sometimes silence shouts louder than a gun," he said. The words settled like dust, soft and fine, but impossible to ignore. No one moved for several long seconds until Cynthia took a breath and broke the stillness with a nod toward Elias. "We've got a briefing in 7 minutes upstairs. You still want to do it?" Elias gave her a faint, almost tired smile. "Of course. But let's not pretend we're walking into that room the same people we were 30 minutes ago." Cynthia allowed herself a small nod, then turned and began walking toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the tile like punctuation marks in a story that had already rewritten itself. Elias followed, but before he reached the elevator, he paused and turned back toward Halden. "I want you to remember something," he said. "The only difference between you and me in this lobby today is that I already knew who I was. You're still figuring it out." Halden didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't retreat. He just stood there, caught somewhere between realization and regret, holding a silence that for once wasn't meant to control anyone else. It was meant to listen. And as the elevator doors opened again, and Elias stepped inside without another word, the lobby returned to what it had always been: polished, stone and still air, but now marked with the invisible trace of a lesson too heavy to forget. The elevator doors slid shut behind Elias with a soft sigh, the kind of quiet that arrives not from peace but from aftermath, a silence packed with everything unsaid. He didn't speak as they began to rise, just stared ahead, the faint glow of the floor numbers reflected in the glass of the polished walls. Cynthia stood beside him, arms folded loosely, but her posture was tight with thought, like a woman already rearranging what this moment would mean in the long arc of consequences. Neither of them broke the stillness with small talk, because some silences earn their place, and filling them would only cheapen what had been laid bare. Elias felt the weight in his chest, shifting, not easing, not yet, but settling deeper like sediment at the bottom of a lake disturbed, and now floating down again slower than before. He had learned over the years that dignity could become its own kind of armor, one you had to forge piece by piece from every instance you were mistaken for less. Still, even with all the practice, even with all the poise, moments like this left a residue, a bitter film that clung to the edges of your calm. And maybe that's why he hadn't said more, because saying it would mean admitting how tired he was of having to be composed just to be safe. When the elevator stopped on the 5th floor and the doors opened again, he stepped out into a hallway of glass partitions and clean lines, the muted hum of productivity already in motion behind closed office doors. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. The people downstairs would carry the weight of that silence without his help now. Cynthia followed a step behind, guiding him down the corridor toward the conference room where the real reason for his visit waited. A cybersecurity case. A high-profile client. A briefing he was still fully prepared to deliver, not because he'd forgotten what happened downstairs, but because professionalism for men like him was often the only thing that could speak louder than injustice. Inside the briefing room, a large screen already displayed the Grayson Intel logo, the agenda scrolling quietly beneath it like nothing had happened. The table was set for 6, with glasses of water, fresh notebooks, and the faint scent of lemon cleaners still hanging in the air. Elias opened his laptop without fanfare, plugged in the HDMI cable, and brought up the first page of encrypted evidence like it was just another Tuesday. And in some ways it was because for him, the extraordinary had become routine, and the routine always carried shadows. Cynthia leaned against the far wall and watched him for a moment before finally speaking. "You didn't have to come up here," she said, her voice low. "No one would have blamed you." Elias didn't look up, just kept typing. "That's exactly why I came," he replied. "Because if I don't show up, then they get to think the silence was enough." She nodded once slowly, then sat across from him, her fingers laced tightly together on the table like she was holding more than just her hands. For the next 45 minutes they worked. They dissected data breaches, traced false identities, mapped access logs to high-level government systems. Elias moved through each slide with the precision of a surgeon, never once slipping, never once letting his voice falter. But beneath each explanation, under each pause for a question, there was something harder to name: a quiet fire burning clean that refused to be dimmed by what had just happened. He wasn't doing it for validation. He wasn't trying to prove he belonged. He was demonstrating what it looked like when someone already knew they did. When the briefing wrapped, Cynthia closed her notebook and stood slowly. "I don't know if it made a difference," she said softly. "What you said downstairs, what I said." Elias finally closed his laptop, his hand still on the lid. "It did," he answered. "Not because they admitted it, but because now they can't forget it." She studied him a moment longer, then slid her portfolio under her arm. "You good to head out?" He nodded once. "Yeah, I just need a minute." She didn't press. She knew what he meant. Sometimes a man needs a hallway to himself just to feel like the world is no longer pressing him down from every direction. When she left, the room grew still again. Elias sat back in his chair, arms folded loosely across his chest, eyes on the screen that now went dim. And in that stillness, he allowed himself a breath, not relief, not release, but something quieter, something more like presence, the kind that says, "I was here, I stood through it, I am still standing." Downstairs, things were not the same. Cruz leaned against the far wall of the lobby, her arms folded, her face unreadable, but her presence unmistakable. She hadn't left. Halden stood near the doors, not speaking, not pacing, just standing like a man still inside the echo of his own mistake. Chelsea had long since vanished from view, the front desk screen glowing silently behind an empty chair. The building hummed with fluorescent light and distant elevator chimes, but something about the space now felt hollow, like the kind of quiet that follows an argument no one won. And yet in that stillness something had shifted. Not enough to erase what happened, but maybe enough to carry it forward in a different shape. Elias would walk back into that lobby soon, and they would see him again, not as a threat, not as a suspect, but as the man who had already given them more grace than they deserved. He would speak if spoken to, or maybe he wouldn't, because sometimes the loudest statement a man can make is walking through the same door head high after being forced to kneel. The lobby hadn't changed much, not in any physical sense. The same polished floors reflected the same filtered light. The front desk still hummed softly with its idle screen, and the elevator dinged with its usual mechanical rhythm, but something in the atmosphere had shifted, like the air itself was carrying the weight of a memory no one could quite put down. Officer Lena Cruz stood near one of the marble columns, arms folded across her chest, not with defensiveness, but with a stillness that suggested she was listening to something far deeper than silence. She hadn't left when Cynthia and Elias had gone upstairs. She hadn't gone back to the cruiser with Halden. She had just stayed. She didn't know why at first, only that walking away felt like letting the moment slip back into the shadows, like pretending it hadn't mattered. And it had. It mattered in the way certain mistakes echo louder in your own ears than in anyone else's voice. She had heard Elias say it calm, composed, factual, but it wasn't the words themselves that stuck with her. It was the restraint in his voice, the way he'd managed to sound steady while kneeling on a floor that had no reason to demand his submission in the first place. Now, as the elevator opened again and Elias stepped out alone, Cruz straightened instinctively, not to intercept, not to justify, just to be present. He didn't look surprised to see her there. He slowed slightly, nodded once, and began walking toward the glass doors. But before he passed, she stepped forward. "Agent Monroe," she said, and he paused, looking at her with that same calm gaze. The one that didn't ask anything, didn't assume, just waited. "I stayed," she said quietly. "Not because anyone asked me to. I just didn't want to walk away from this like it didn't happen." Elias didn't answer right away. He studied her face, not searching for guilt, but for something real, something earned. "You saw my badge," he said, voice low. "You read it. You knew it, checked out." Cruz nodded slowly. "I did," she said. "And I still stood there while it played out, like maybe it wasn't real. I didn't speak up. I didn't challenge him. I just watched." There was no apology in her voice, and none was needed, not yet. What mattered wasn't the phrasing but the ownership, the willingness to name what others preferred to bury under policy and procedure. Elias nodded once, his expression unchanged. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, not cold but not inviting absolution either. Cruz exhaled, her arms unfolding slightly, hands hanging loose at her sides. "Because I don't want to be another person who sees the truth too late and says nothing about it. Because saying it out loud is the least I can do." Elias didn't flinch, didn't look away, and something about that stillness made the moment feel sharper, more honest. "Apologies don't fix much," he said. "They don't erase fear or undo years of what people carry quietly." "I know," Cruz replied, "but maybe accountability starts with hearing yourself say it." There was a silence after that, not heavy, not awkward, just present. Like both of them understood that not all damage shouts when it's done. Some of it lingers in the way people remember how they stood in a room and said nothing. "I thought I understood what bias looked like," she said softer now, "but I didn't know it could wear a uniform like mine, speak through my silence, and still let me believe I was doing nothing wrong." Elias let the weight of her words sit there for a moment before answering. "It wears all kinds of things," he said quietly. "Suits, scrubs, security shirts. It even sits behind reception desks, smiling while it calls the police." Cruz gave a small, rueful smile at that, not out of humor but out of recognition, the kind that stings a little because it's earned. "You think Halden still has a shot at the Bureau?" she asked, and the question wasn't flippant. It was honest, born from a need to believe that mistakes when faced directly don't have to be the end of someone's story. Elias looked down for a second, then back up. His face grew more serious. "He does," he said, "but only if he's honest with himself first. The Bureau doesn't need more people who carry power without understanding it." She nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, not defending her partner, but not abandoning him either. Some truths can't be carried alone, and some have to be held in quiet reflection before they change anything at all. Elias stepped toward the door, and Cruz didn't follow. She didn't need to. What needed to be said had been said, and what needed to be heard would echo longer than any lecture or reprimand ever could. And as he reached for the handle, he paused, turned slightly, and said without looking back, "Tell him the interview's still on, but I won't be the one doing all the talking." Then he stepped through the glass doors into the gray afternoon beyond, leaving behind a silence, not of shame but of reckoning, quiet, yes, but real, and that for once might be enough to change something. Outside, the sky had settled into a soft, dull gray, the kind that made everything feel suspended, like time itself was undecided about whether to move forward or pause a while longer. The parking lot was half-empty, rain-streaked, quiet in that suburban afternoon way where even the wind seemed to move gently so it wouldn't disturb anything too loudly. Elias stepped outside the glass doors with a calm that didn't announce itself. It just lived in the way he carried his shoulders, in the rhythm of his breath, in the stillness behind his eyes. He didn't expect anyone to be waiting, not after all that had been said, not after the story had already tipped its final card. But there, leaning against the rear panel of a squad car, arms crossed and posture uncertain, stood Officer Halden. Elias slowed his pace slightly, but didn't stop letting the sight register without letting it define the moment. Halden straightened, not aggressively, more like someone preparing to stand inside the weight of his own consequences. For a long second, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind through nearby trees, and the distant rhythm of a bird calling once, then falling quiet again. Halden looked up, and when he met Elias's gaze, there wasn't challenge or apology in his face. Just something unguarded, something stripped of the role he wore and the badge he'd used to fill the silence between himself and responsibility. "I didn't want to leave like that," Halden said finally, his voice low, flat, not defensive, just worn down by something heavier than embarrassment. Elias stopped a few feet away, not leaning, not bracing, just standing, waiting, giving space without conceding anything he hadn't already earned. This morning, Halden continued, eyes scanning the lot, as if afraid to look directly at the man he had forced to the ground. "I thought I knew who I was. Thought I was the guy who didn't let things like this happen on his watch." There was no sarcasm in his tone, no rehearsed contrition, only the quiet collapse of certainty, the kind that doesn't happen all at once, but begins the moment a man realizes his reflection no longer aligns with the story he tells about himself. Elias let the words hang there, not rushing to answer, not easing the tension with forgiveness that hadn't been asked for. He knew what it meant to stand in that fragile space between realization and repair, to learn that the hardest part of growth isn't admitting fault, it's learning how to move differently after it. And now Elias asked, his voice soft but not gentle, because some truths don't need volume, they just need to be placed precisely where they can't be ignored. Halden glanced down, then back up. "Now I think maybe I've just been lucky," he said. "Lucky that no one ever made me see how much I was getting wrong." Elias nodded once slowly, and there was no triumph in his expression, only a gravity, a kind of tired understanding carved by experience and reinforced by repetition. "You know," Elias said after a pause in the bureau, "we deal with behavior patterns. We analyze people for a living. We track what they do without knowing why they do it." Halden listened, not interrupting, not shrinking, just taking it in like a man finally ready to be uncomfortable in a way that might actually mean something. "But what we don't talk about enough," Elias continued, "is that we're not immune to those same patterns. We make assumptions. We see what we're conditioned to see. And sometimes that conditioning wears a uniform and calls itself protocol." Halden didn't respond. He didn't need to. The way he stood still, quiet, open, was response enough. Elias reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper weathered at the creases from being read too many times. He held it out without ceremony. "It's a prep sheet," he said. "For your bureau interview. Real questions, real scenarios. Things that'll test how you think when the frame doesn't match the facts." Halden took the page, unfolding it carefully like it might shatter if handled too fast. His eyes scanned the first few lines, then froze. "Why are you giving me this?" he asked, voice caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. Elias met his eyes fully now, the silence between them heavier than it had ever been inside that lobby. "Because growth doesn't happen when someone tells you you're right," Elias said. "It starts when someone shows you where you were wrong and you decide to stay anyway." Halden looked down again at the paper, then back up, and for the first time that day, his posture didn't carry fear or control, just honesty, raw and unguarded. Elias turned toward his car keys already in hand, the moment closing not with applause or applause-worthy lines, but with a truth so personal it didn't need a witness. And as he walked away, he said one last thing over his shoulder. Not loud, not sharp, but enough to leave a mark. "Next time you walk into a room," he said, "don't just look at what's there. Ask yourself what you might be missing." And with that, Elias Monroe disappeared behind the driver's side door, not escaping, not retreating, but simply moving forward, as men like him always had to do. Alone, intact, and still listening to a world that too often refused to listen back. The drive back from the building was quiet, just the soft hum of tires against wet pavement, and the muted rhythm of the windshield wipers moving in a steady arc across the glass. Elias sat behind the wheel, one hand resting loosely at 12 o'clock, the other draped over the door, fingers tapping faintly, not from nerves, but from the residue of something heavier than adrenaline. His breath was steady, his shoulders relaxed, but his mind kept circling back not to the confrontation itself, but to the moment it shifted, the second where a man in uniform began to realize the story he'd written in his head no longer matched the one unfolding in front of him. That moment, quiet as it was, had weight. And that weight followed Elias now, not as a burden, but as something earned, something he carried not for himself, but for the countless others who never got to speak their name before someone made up their mind about it. The sky hadn't changed much, still that overcast silver that blurred edges and softened contrast, but Elias found comfort in the gray, in the way it made the world less harsh, less divided between light and dark. He turned into the lot of the small federal annex where he kept a reserved space parked in the far corner where no one ever blocked you in. He sat for a moment after turning off the engine, watching the wipers pause mid-swing before the power cut. Around him, a few other cars idled or emptied, agents and staff, unaware that something deeper than traffic delay had just unfolded a few miles away. Elias reached into the passenger seat and picked up the sheet of interview prep he'd handed Halden just minutes earlier, now creased and slightly damp from where it had touched his sleeve. He looked at the questions again, ethical dilemmas, pressure scenarios, race-coded assumptions masked as policy tests. They weren't written to trap anyone, only to reveal what already lived inside them waiting for the wrong moment to rise. And yet today had proven something those questions couldn't, how little it took to unmask a system pretending to be neutral when the real test had always been whether you could see the difference between fear and fact. He stepped out of the car and took a slow breath of the cool afternoon air, the scent of damp concrete mixing with distant leaves and the faint tang of fuel from the road nearby. It grounded him, not in a romantic way, not as some poetic reset, but in the way a man reminds himself he still chooses to stand when the easier option would be to turn back. He moved toward the entrance, nodding briefly at a security officer he'd passed a dozen times before but never really spoken to. The man gave him a quick nod in return, friendly but forgettable. Elias wondered for a half-second whether that same man would have asked for his ID if he were wearing street clothes and not carrying a bureau badge. Inside the building was quiet, the lighting soft, the corridors muted. His office sat at the end of a short hallway lined with frosted glass panels, behind which sat teams of analysts and support staff typing away, eyes locked on screens, unaware of the human equations playing out just beyond their reach. Elias pushed open the door to his office, set the prep sheet down on the desk, and slid into the chair with a quiet exhale that felt longer than it sounded. The leather creaked faintly beneath him, a small sound in a space designed to be neutral, efficient, controlled. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he let the afternoon gray filter through the blinds, casting soft lines across the surface of the desk where case files sat untouched. For a long minute he didn't reach for anything, not the keyboard, not the phone, not the reports, waiting to be signed. He just sat, letting the weight of the day land fully, letting the silence fill in what conversation could never quite finish. Then, without thinking, he reached for his notepad, the old kind, spiral-bound ink stained from years of field use. He opened to a blank page and without heading or introduction began to write. There is a moment in every encounter where a choice is made, not always spoken, not always conscious, but made nonetheless. It is the moment when suspicion overrides observation, when assumption replaces inquiry, and when power unchecked becomes blindness. He paused, stared at the words, and kept writing. Today, that moment lasted 7 minutes. And in those 7 minutes, a man nearly lost the right to his name, not because of who he was, but because someone else refused to see him. He didn't write it to document the incident. There would be no formal complaint, no internal review launched, no policy rewritten overnight. What he wrote was for himself, for the space between dignity and exhaustion, for the part of him that refused to let this become just another story he filed away. As he closed the notebook, he heard a soft knock on the door. He turned, and standing there, holding 2 coffee cups, was Cynthia. "I figured you hadn't had a real break all day," she said. Elias stood, took one of the cups with a faint smile, and motioned to the empty chair across from his desk. "You were right!" She sat, took a sip, and looked at him with that same steady calm that had diffused so many boardrooms and back channels alike. "You still thinking about him?" she asked. Elias nodded slowly. "I'm thinking about all the times we don't get to say what we mean. All the chances we don't take to ask better questions." Cynthia tilted her head. "Think he'll take the interview?" Elias looked at the notebook on the table, then back at her. "Maybe," he said. "But only if he wants to do more than wear the badge. He's got to live with it." The two sat in silence for a while, not as colleagues or agents, but as people who had seen too much and still chose to stay. Outside, the sky began to lighten just slightly, not enough to break the clouds, but enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the light was still trying to get through. The meeting had ended over an hour ago, but Elias still felt the shape of it in his shoulders, in the slow release of tension that never truly left, only sank deeper until it became part of how a man held himself. He walked back through the quiet corridors of the annex, the soles of his shoes muted against the low-pile carpet, the hall lined with closed doors and the occasional muffled voice behind glass. Everything looked the same as it always did, orderly, polished, productive. But beneath the surface, something in him had shifted, subtle but permanent, like the soft click of a locked drawer he no longer needed to reopen. He stepped out into the parking lot under a thinning sky, the cloud cover beginning to break just enough to let a few strips of pale light fall across the pavement. The air smelled of recent rain and warm asphalt, and a single bird called once from a nearby fence before fluttering out of sight. There was a kind of calm in that moment, not peace exactly, but a stillness that came after surviving something others would never fully see. He moved toward his car keys already in hand, and for the first time all day, his steps felt entirely his own. As he approached, he caught the faintest reflection of himself in the side mirror, not just his face, but his posture, the line of his back, the small crease between his brows he hadn't noticed forming until now. He paused for half a breath, not out of vanity, but because sometimes after a day like this, a man needs to see that he's still standing. He opened the door, slid behind the wheel, and sat there for a moment without starting the engine, letting the silence of the car wrap around him like a loose thread, finally being drawn tight. Across the lot, the spaces were nearly empty, the afternoon crowd having come and gone, their errands finished, their roles played. But Elias didn't move right away. He leaned back, resting his left hand on the steering wheel, his right still lightly touching the center console, and let his mind settle into the quiet. He wasn't thinking about the briefing or the reports or even the questions still waiting in the back of his inbox. He was thinking about how close the line always was between being seen and being judged, between being recognized and being erased. He thought about the receptionist Chelsea and the way her hands trembled when she realized what she'd done without meaning to. He thought about Cruz and how she stayed, how she spoke not to be forgiven, but because she needed to say it out loud. And he thought about Halden standing beside that cruiser, holding a sheet of paper like it weighed more than any weapon, not because it could hurt him, but because it asked him to look at himself. Elias knew what the world expected men like him to do: move on, let it slide, chalk it up as another lesson in the invisible curriculum of staying composed under pressure. But he also knew that silence was never neutral. Silence was where misunderstanding lived, where fear calcified, where bias took root and called itself policy. And even when no apology came, even when no one followed him out the door to ask if he was all right, he had made the choice to stand not just for himself, but for the next time someone like him walked into a lobby with nothing but a name, purpose, and the quiet hope they'd be allowed to do their job in peace. He finally turned the key in the ignition, the engine coming to life with a low, steady hum, the air vents pushing a soft breeze across the dash. As he pulled out of the lot, he didn't look back at the building. He didn't need to. The story wasn't behind him now. It had followed him out. And it would follow others too, not as a warning but as a memory, as a lesson, as a question hanging quietly in the space between judgment and understanding. A question every officer, every civilian, every passerby should ask before they pick up the phone, raise a hand, or hesitate to speak. What story am I about to write, and who am I writing it about? By the time Elias reached home, the light had begun to change the sky, opening just enough to let through a soft amber glow, the kind that slides quietly across the tops of trees and rooftops without announcing itself. The neighborhood was calm, not silent, but comfortable in that late afternoon way, with the sound of distant lawnmowers, a barking dog somewhere down the street, and the clink of dishes being rinsed through an open window. He pulled into the driveway, shifted the car into park, and just sat there for a minute, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes unfocused, breathing slow, and even like he was waiting for his body to catch up to the stillness outside. He wasn't tired in the usual sense. It wasn't the kind of fatigue that sleep would cure or coffee would mask. It was something older, something that lived beneath the skin, an accumulation of moments of choices made quietly in the face of noise, of knowing that every time you speak softly in a loud room, you risk not being heard at all. He reached over, picked up his badge from the passenger seat, turned it over once in his hand, and watched the gold catch the dying light through the windshield. It was clean, official, precise. But even now it felt heavier than it should have. He stepped out of the car and closed the door gently behind him, the metallic thud echoing just faintly between the rows of quiet houses. His boots crunched slightly against the gravel, lining the walkway, and as he approached the front door, he paused to take in the sound of wind rustling through the neighbor's maple tree, the kind of small detail that reminded him he was home, even if his mind was still somewhere else. Inside the house smelled faintly of cedar and clean fabric, the warmth of familiarity, soaking into him like a blanket you didn't realize you needed until it was already wrapped around you. He set his briefcase down, loosened his collar, and poured a glass of water from the kitchen sink, drinking it slowly, like each sip might rinse away something invisible clinging to the back of his throat. Then he sat at the small writing desk tucked beneath the front window, opened his notebook again, and turned to a fresh page. He didn't write with urgency. He wrote with rhythm, with the deliberate motion of someone trying not to forget what it felt like to carry the truth through a room that didn't want to hear it. 7 minutes, he wrote. That's all it took to almost dismantle a life, to unravel trust, to fracture a moment that should have been routine. 7 minutes where every word I said was held up to a mirror of doubt, and every silence around me said more than any accusation ever could. He paused, pressing the pen gently against the paper, then continued. It didn't escalate because someone shouted. It escalated because someone didn't ask. Because fear wore the face of authority and didn't stop to check its reflection. He closed the notebook carefully and placed it back on the shelf, not to forget, but to remember differently, to store the memory in a place that wouldn't turn bitter. He stepped outside again onto the back porch where the sun had finally broken through the clouds in wide, low beams stretching across the horizon. The air was cooler, now brushed with evening, and somewhere in the distance a child laughed the way only children do, loud and unbothered, like the world had never tried to teach them to lower their voice. Elias watched the light shift across the trees, and for the first time all day he let himself feel something close to peace, not because anything had been fixed, but because something had been faced. That he knew was the beginning of every real change, not the confrontation, not the outrage, but the reckoning afterward in the quiet, when people are left alone with the memory of what they chose to do or chose not to. This story wouldn't be in the news. There'd be no headlines, no press release, no policy drafted by morning. But it would stay with every person who was there in different ways, etched into posture, memory, habit. For Elias, it would become one more story added to the collection he never wanted to build, a story that reminded him why he stayed, why he wore the badge, why he chose again and again not to look away. He stepped down into the grass hands in his pockets and let the light fall across his face as the wind moved gently through the yard. Behind him, the house stood still, warm and waiting. Before him, the sky opened just a little more. And somewhere inside that space between what had happened and what might happen next was the quiet truth no one could erase. That dignity doesn't always come with a badge, and justice doesn't always arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it walks out the front door head high, 7 minutes older, and infinitely more seen. What happened in those 7 minutes wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a mirror. A mirror showing how quickly fear can replace reason, how silence can become complicity, and how dignity must sometimes be defended not with anger but with unwavering presence. This story reminds us that respect isn't something granted based on appearance, badge, or title. It's something owed to every human being the moment they enter a room. And it reminds us, especially in moments of quiet tension, that doing nothing is still a choice. For those of us who've lived through years of change, who've seen this pattern repeat across decades, it's easy to feel tired. But stories like this ask us not to look away. They ask us to stay awake, to speak up, not for attention but for accountability. Whether you wear a uniform, sit behind a desk, or stand by in silence, you hold power. And with that power comes a simple question: will you see people clearly, or will you wait until it's too late? If this story moved you, if it made you think about the weight of a moment or the cost of a single assumption, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Because we don't just tell these stories to entertain, we tell them to remember, to reflect, and maybe, just maybe, to begin doing better. Thank you for watching.